French President Emmanuel Macron is on a whirlwind diplomatic mission this week. He met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow yesterday. Today, Macron met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The French president says Putin assured him Russia would not escalate the crisis. That assurance being met with big skepticism in Ukraine, and the Kremlin is denying that any sort of de-escalation deal was struck. What will the French president's shuttle diplomacy change? Ivo Daalder is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He previously served as U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Ambassador Daalder is in Palm Springs, California. Ambassador Daalder, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
I'd like to start, sir, if I could, with the efforts of French President Emmanuel Macron and what he's doing diplomatically. He met with Vladimir Putin yesterday in Moscow. He's in Kyiv today, meeting with the Ukrainian president. What do you make of Macron's efforts?
Well, I think he's trying to find a way out short of a military confrontation. And I think all of us want to find a solution to this problem without the massive Russian military that is now arrayed alongside Ukraine actually being set in motion. So I think he's focusing on sort of two big things. One is there a way to get finally a solution to the conflict in Ukraine? Remember, Russia invaded Crimea, annexed Crimea, and then through its support directly and in many other ways behind an internal insurgency, there was an agreement signed back in 2014, modified in 2015, the so-called Minsk agreement to resolve that issue. No one has implemented it, in part because it had some very difficult asks, both from the Russians and from the Ukrainians. So he's trying to revive that process. And at the same time, he's trying to figure out, is there a way to satisfy or address Russian security concerns with regard to NATO without in any way changing the principles, including the principle that countries can choose their own alliances. So it's a valiant effort. I hope he succeeds. I think it's going to be a long shot, but we should hope that peace prevails over war, particularly as long as the principles that are key to us are upheld.
There's a divergence in the analysis of it, though, right? I mean, the French president is sort of striking this optimistic tone on the diplomatic front, but a lot of analysts fear that, Russia is just engaging in these talks to buy time for its military to make its final preparations for an invasion a lot of people say is inevitable. I mean, where do you stand on that question?
Well, I'm sort of with the latter. I don't think we should give up on diplomacy because we just don't know at what point Putin decides that he's willing to look for a diplomatic as opposed to a military option. But I do think that what Putin is after is something that is not going to be achieved through diplomacy, which is he wants to control de facto, if not de jure, Ukraine. He wants to make sure that it is no longer capable of acting as an independent country. He worries not only about Ukraine choosing to align with NATO, he worries about Ukraine being independent. He worries about Ukraine being a successful democracy. He worries about the people in Ukraine setting an example of what can be achieved through democracy and prosperity to his own subjects in Russia. He worries ultimately about his own power situation inside Russia, which he fears can only be maintained if he also controls not just Russia, which he does with an iron fist, but also his immediate neighborhood. And we saw that playing out in Belarus in 2020. We saw it again playing out in Kazakhstan and just earlier this year, and we're seeing it playing out in Ukraine. And that issue can't be resolved through diplomacy because it means Ukraine basically surrendering to Russia, which it's not about to do.
There's been this flurry of high-level meetings, and on this side of the Atlantic, President Biden met with the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, yesterday in Washington, and it appeared to be an effort to project unity in this crisis. Do you think they were able to accomplish that?
Every country and every leader has its own domestic politics to worry about. And so they will all emphasize something differently. And yesterday on the issue that many reporters were pushing on Nord Stream 2, the emphasis was slightly different. The real question I ask myself is, when the chips are down, on what side is everyone going to be? And I have no doubt, having sat around the NATO table for 4 years, that when the chips are down, when there's a serious military crisis like this one, that ultimately may lead to the use of military force in Europe, perhaps on a scale we haven't seen since 1945. I have no doubt that every single one of the 30 NATO members will stand united in their response, both through sanctions of the kind that we haven't seen with regard to Russia, and frankly haven't seen with regard to many countries in the world, and with regard to beefing up NATO and helping Ukraine support its capacity to self-defense. So on those issues, I have no doubt. And as President Biden said, if they move militarily, Nord Stream 2 is not going to operate. So I think in the main, we have 30 independent countries, leaders who are democratically elected and need to make sure that they have their domestic politics in a row. But when the chips are down, NATO is going to be united.
Well, the president said that about Nord Stream 2, but the chancellor did not, right? The chancellor was a little bit more equivocal, saying it's important we don't spell out everything in public. I mean, how do you read that? I know you talked about the chips being down, but on this pipeline, Germany is not as bombastic as the United States at this point in time.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of domestic German politics that's at play here. I mean, there are legal issues. This is not a pipeline that is owned by the German government. It's a private enterprise. It's a private pipeline, and in order to shut it down, you have to change some significant laws. What I think the German chancellor is unwilling to do, and by the way, he's a socialist, a social democratic prime minister, follows a Christian democratic prime minister, Angela Merkel, who had exactly the same position, which is that we are not yet prepared to say that we're going to shut this down. But is it at all feasible that if Ukraine is invaded further by Russia, and there are troops moving in large formations in Europe, that they're going to turn on a pipeline that, by the way, hasn't been turned on yet, and start and have Russian gas flowing through it? I just don't think that's conceivable. And even if Chancellor Scholz was unable to say so publicly, I wish he had. Of course, the reality is everyone knows that if that happens, no gas is going to flow through that pipeline.
You know, the question of if it happens, when it happens, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said last month that she thinks Putin is factoring the Beijing Olympics in his decision about when to possibly launch an invasion. This because President Xi would not be happy if Russia pulled attention away from the games. Do you think that is playing a factor here?
No, I don't actually think that the Olympics are playing a factor. It just happens that that a number of things are aligning. I mean, we've had some reports that came out yesterday on CNN with some unhappiness by senior Russian military officials who thought that the original plan was just too risky and they wanted more time to build up the forces. They've gotten an extra month or so. Maximum frost is going to be at around mid to late February. That's what you want on the ground for large armored formations to move. The fact that the Olympic is also ending at the same time is a positive for Putin, but I don't think it's determinative. This is not about the Olympics. This is really about Putin and what he wants from Ukraine.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your insight and your time. Thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.